Thank you all for your patience. And thank you again, Assemblyman Aubrey, for that introduction. And it's great to be here with so many distinguished guests and great friends and folks that have been doing great work in this business for such a long, long time. It's also great to be here today, up here with such a distinguished panel and such a great group of experts that really know this work well, and I look forward to hearing from them here in just a moment. This panel will provide us all with an opportunity to hear a little bit more about how justice reinvestment has really worked on the ground, the processes, the challenges, and the successes that we've seen to date. Without a doubt, the folks that we have assembled here today are the ones that we call the go-to people on this initiative. They're the ones that can tell you actually how it worked because they've lived it, they've been there, and I think the saying goes, you've got the t-shirt, right? Adam got it. For BJA, we couldn't be more proud to have supported this initiative from the beginning with the Council for State Government. When we think of BJA resources, many of us, including ourselves, we often think of our resources in a very specific way. And that is, we often think about the funding and the dollars that we get that we know are very, very important to the field. And sometimes when we talk about the resources from BJA and the Office of Justice Programs, we also talk about training that comes as part of our resources. We know that that is important as well. But the resource that can often have the most significant impact at the local level is the technical assistance. And you heard a couple of folks talk about that here today. It really doesn't take a lot of money. Really what it takes is getting people on the ground to help states and counties, Don, to do what they know they need to do. Right? They have the answers, we just need to help them get to that solution. And so that's why technical assistance is so important. It is essentially the glue that holds the resources together and what takes the programs and the initiatives to the next level of implementation. The Justice Reinvestment Initiative is a superb example of this idea. For the past several years, BJA has supported CSG and the Justice Reinvestment Initiative as a technical assistance initiative. And the results, I think, speak for themselves, and you'll hear about those today, and I'm sure you've heard about them before today as well. I want to thank our friends here in Congress, those that you've heard from here this morning, and others that have talked to us about this initiative for their support, and their support in providing the technical assistance that has been a part of this initiative since day one. And I hope that they have the opportunity to see today as well what we see as one of the best returns on investment possible. Results-oriented assistance that is leveraging change within the states and within local communities. Whether the change ultimately is improving efficiency in the justice system or providing greater accountability or generally creating a more effective justice system or a combination of these outcomes, it is substantial. As the Attorney General said this morning, and Assistant Attorney General Lori Robinson certainly echoed, it's our vision that justice reinvestment, when combined with the resources provided so graciously by Congress and the administration for the Second Chance Act and other similar and related programs, this provides our best opportunity to make these improvements across the entire country, state by state and county by county. As I mentioned when I began here this morning, we have a very distinguished panel assembled here today. And I'd like to now turn your attention to them to bring you what you really need to hear about the Justice Reinvestment Initiative. Now, following their remarks, we hope to have some time for some discussion where you have an opportunity to interact with these panelists. The order of our presentation this morning will follow the order of these introductions. First, I have the great pleasure to introduce Adam Gelb, who's the Director of the Public Safety Performance Project at the Pew Center on the States. Adam directs the Pew Center on the States Public Safety Performance Project, which works with more than a dozen states to advance fiscally sound and data-driven policies in sentencing and corrections that protect public safety, hold offenders accountable, and control corrections spending. He has been involved in crime control and prevention issues for the past 20 years as a journalist, a congressional aide, and a senior state government official. Before joining Pew, he served as Vice President for Programs at the Georgia Council on Substance Abuse, overseeing drug prevention and juvenile offender reentry initiatives. Adam earned a bachelor's degree in history and government from the University of Virginia and a master's degree in public policy from the Harvard University's John F. Kennedy School of Government. Following Adam's discussion, we will hear from Texas State Representative Jerry Madden. Representative Madden was first elected to the Texas legislature in 1992 and is now in his 9th term. Congratulations. Madden is Vice President of the House Committee on Corrections, which he chaired from 2005 to 2009, and is a member of the Judiciary and Civil Jurisprudence Committee. A graduate of West Point with a Bachelor of Science in Engineering, he also holds a Master of Science in Management and Administration Sciences from the University of Texas at Dallas. He was instrumental in the 2007 criminal justice system reforms, which sought to divert individuals from prison through mental health and drug treatment programs, providing more opportunities in prison for rehabilitation, and serves as well on the Texas Criminal Justice Integrity Unit, which is charged with exploring ways within that state to avoid wrongful convictions. Representative Madden's presentation will be followed by a presentation by Secretary Roger Werholtz, who is the Secretary of Corrections, was appointed by, in the Kansas Department of Corrections, was appointed by then Governor Kathleen Sebelius on January 13, 2003. He served as Deputy Secretary of Corrections and has supervised all 3 divisions of the Kansas Department of Corrections. Secretary Werholtz holds a master's degree in social work from the University of Kansas and holds a Bachelor of Arts degree from Washburn University. And I must say that I don't know how Roger keeps up with all of the work. I know use him a lot on the Justice Reinvestment Initiative, but we've also tapped into his expertise for many other corrections-related efforts from BJA. And so you must have a ton of frequent flyer miles. And last, closing out our panel, we're going to hear from someone I think we all know, Michael Thompson, who's the director of CSG's Justice Center. Michael has worked on criminal justice policy issues with the Council of State Governments since 1997. He has launched and overseen various national policy initiatives that have prompted congressional hearings, federal legislation, national news coverage, and bipartisan legislative and programmatic initiatives in states across the country. Prior to joining CSG, he worked for 3 years for the Office of the Court Monitor, which was created by a U.S. District Court judge and established in San Juan, Puerto Rico. Mike received his Bachelor of Arts degree with honors from Middlebury College. So with that, I'd like to turn it over to our first presenter, Adam. Please come up.
Good morning. I was asked to sort of set the stage here, which is a tough thing to do after the panel this morning, since the stage was set so well. In fact, I think in the presentation we're about to give, I think probably every single point that we have in here has already been made this morning, which is fast, but we got the pictures to go with it. But before I do that, just really want to say it's a terrific pleasure and honor to be here working with BJA, the Council of State Governments, Public Welfare Foundation, not only in the work that we're doing in the states, but obviously the event here today, and being able to come together and focus on how we got to where we are and where we're going from here. And also just want to quickly thank the team at Pew that worked really hard alongside Council of State Governments Justice Center folks in putting this together. Richard Jerome, Joe Gavrilovich, and Corrine Mills in particular. Thank you all. So let's get to the pictures. 4 quick points here about, again, how we got to where we are and where we are going. First is that correctional populations and costs are at an all-time high. Second, that this is because of policy choices, not because of broad social, economic, demographic forces that are outside the scope or control or influence of policy leaders at the federal, state, and local levels. Third, that the public safety payoff of all this growth in spending and populations is been low. And fourth, that because the payoff has been low in terms of public safety and the cost so high, we're seeing the debate really change around the country, reflected in the panel and the bipartisanship here this morning. People are well familiar, obviously, with the growth in the correctional population over time, but if you look at this chart, it's really sort of, and if you've been paying attention to this issue the last 10, 15, 20, even 25 years, you probably have just thought that, well, if prison population is just, that's what it does, it rises. The population is growing, maybe we have more crime, and therefore the population is going to go up. But you take a look at that and realize that for a solid 50 years in this country, despite rapidly growing population, we had a stable incarceration rate for that entire period. Yet in the late 70s, we really started to grow fast on account of, again, some policy decisions that were made to the point that now, in 2008, for the first time, we have 1 in 100 adults in this country behind bars. As I think it was Senator Whitehouse mentioned this morning, when you look at the entire population, it's now 1 in 31 adults are under some form of correctional control. So we look at this sort of middle, second from the bottom slice, the light blue slice there, and that's the prison population that gives rise to that dramatic prison curve. But when you put it in context with the rest of the correctional population, you notice that, you know, for every person we've put in prison, we actually have put 2 additional people on probation and parole. So if we thought we were going to sort of build our way out of the crime problem, we haven't. In fact, that ratio stays just about the same for every out of every 3 felony offenders in this country, we've got about 1 behind bars and 2 in the community. And despite putting 1 million more people behind bars over the last 25 years, that ratio has stayed the same, 2 in the community, roughly the same, 2 in the community for every 1 behind bars. The significant racial dynamic here with 1 in 9 black males aged 20 to 34 behind bars. If you sort of think about that overall correctional control rate, unfortunately the data doesn't give us precise numbers, but if there are 2 people in the community for every 1 behind bars, that 1 to 9 rate there for black males behind bars would probably be somewhat right in the neighborhood of 1 in 4, maybe 1 in 5 black males in that age under some form of correctional supervision. And then also over here on the bottom, just note that even though incarceration is so heavily tilted toward men, that for women, black women ages in their late 30s, the rate has reached 1 in 100 for that population as well. Just also very quickly, a huge part of this, I think most folks in here know, has been driven, it was discussed this morning, by the technical violator population. Justice Department statistics show that about 36% of admissions to prison at this point are now parole violators. If you add probation violators in there, we don't have, unfortunately, some good national numbers on this, but our work in the states and with CSG, when you look under the hood here and see who's going into prison, you find about half. Generally, some states are higher, some are lower, but about half of prison admissions are people who not necessarily have even committed a new crime, but people who have broken the rules of their supervision and are being put back behind the walls for those reasons. Again, as mentioned this morning, we do stick out like a sore thumb. The top bar here shows 35 countries in Europe with the largest prison populations. Their population is not quite 3 times the size of ours, but those 35 countries together incarcerate about 1.8 million compared to our 2.3. What's all this cost? The cost curves look similar to the population ones. Here is the data showing that the increase over the past 21 years from about 10 billion to about 47 billion. That is just the general fund. You heard the figure 52 million before. That would include bond funding, other special funds. So the total cost to states is about $52 billion at this point, an almost 5-fold increase in this period. Second fastest, corrections being the second fastest growing category of state spending behind Medicaid. And the last year that we have data for, I think it was FY08, corrections was actually for that year the fastest growing category of state budget spending, even though the population growth has slowed a little bit. We wanted to peel back the onion a little bit in terms of correction spending, how much is going to prisons versus parole and probation, especially looking at those population dynamics, since we knew that parole and probation population grew very fast and in pace with the prison population. So here you see the sort of how the the population slices down with prisons, again, sort of the slice of 1/3 of the population. But when we collected data from states around the country on where the money was going, it obviously is going to prisons here. So prisons account for about 32% of the correctional population, but 88%, almost 90% of correctional spending. Obviously, it costs more to keep somebody behind bars to supervise them in the community, but the ratio turns out to be about 22 to 1, with a day in prison costing almost $80 a day, and we're spending about $3.42 per day on probation. And those figures have raised a lot of questions in folks' minds about, hey, what if we had supervision that was maybe $13.42 a day? We could really beef up supervision and services and reduce recidivism and still do that at a fraction of the cost of a prison cell. Another barometer that's gained a lot of interest lately, many of you saw Governor Schwarzenegger's comments in his State of the State address here about California's priorities, looking at the difference in where states have been putting their money over the last 21 years, a huge increase in this correctional spending compared to a very much more modest investment in higher ed. So what's been the impact? This slide is designed to daze and confuse you as much as possible. But what it does is plot the states on sort of how they did over the past 10 years in terms of the change in incarceration, which is the horizontal axis, and change in the crime rate, which is the vertical axis going down. So all these states sort of below and to the right here are states that both reduce their crime rate and increase their incarceration rate. But notice the variance here. I mean, there are states, if you sort of take this vertical slice here, with states that increase their incarceration rate at about the same. So you have sort of here you have Kentucky and Tennessee and Massachusetts, Colorado up and down, and here huge differences in how states responded over the last 10 years or so. And notice that the 7 states off to the left of that vertical axis, those are 7 states that actually saw reductions in both their crime and incarceration rates. So just to try to simplify that sort of way to look at this, we pulled out 3 states here. So Nevada, Louisiana, and Minnesota all had crime drops from 97 to 07 of 25%. But look at what happened with incarceration in those states. Huge differences. Nevada actually reduced its incarceration rate. Louisiana and Minnesota, significant increases. So vastly different changes in incarceration producing similar impact on crime. So lots else is obviously going on here. No one is saying, I don't think there would be anybody in this room who's going to argue that violent and career criminals ought to be locked up and for a long time. It's the question of when you have reached these incarceration levels this high and the correctional net has been cast so wide, there is a general consensus in the field at this point that we've reached diminishing returns and that locking up more people will produce less and less crime reduction. I think that's reflected in that chart. So when you put all this together, the very high costs and the relatively low returns, you have a landscape along with the emerging field of evidence-based practices and things that is increasingly persuasive to state policymakers and obviously here at the federal level as well, that we can do something about this. This is not again something that state policymakers and taxpayers just sort of have to be stuck with the bill. There's a bunch of individual decisions that are made by police officers and judges and prosecutors, and they just all roll up to the state, and you just have to sort of sit there and take it. There are things that can be done, and we're going to be hearing some fabulous examples of that this morning. But as a final thought, the real change that we're seeing that has occurred is one where just a few years ago, this was the predominant question in this field. And we wouldn't try to argue that it's not, that this question is not still the major one out there. How do I demonstrate as a state policymaker or at any level that I'm tough on crime. Certainly still a concern, but more and more, because of the kind of evidence and figures that we've just looked at, we're seeing a new question that's being asked, which how do we get taxpayers a better return on their investment in public safety? And I think you'd all agree it's a much better question. Big changes are happening with the leadership of folks like Jerry Madden, Roger Werholtz at the state level. Just a real pleasure to be here, and hope that you all are able to stay through the lunch and into the afternoon. We've got some additional fabulous panels of experts from around the country to talk in some more depth about how these strategies are working and how we can in fact have less crime at lower cost. So thank you.
I've got some slides up there which I'll probably totally ignore. So Adam and I have done these things a few times before now around the country, talking about what works and what doesn't, because Texas has actually been one that's done a whole lot of things. And I'm honored really to be here with this group today, because I'm probably the rookie in this whole group. I'm the one that probably has less time in criminal justice than almost everybody sitting in this room. My involvement really in it started almost 5 years ago to the day, when my speaker called me in and said, "Jerry, you're chairman of corrections." And I said, "Okay, thank you, Mr. Speaker. Obviously, it's a big honor to be named a committee chairman in any state." And then under my breath, I'm thinking to myself, "Oh God, why me? What happened to me? What did I do to deserve this?" Because I'm not a lawyer. I've never been involved in the criminal justice issues. It was not part of the things I did in the legislature at all. It was, one of those things that I'd just get up, and I'm a very conservative Republican, and I could just vote, tough on crime all the way through, and boy, it sounded real good. So my first question to him was, well, what do I do? What do you want me to do, Mr. Speaker? And the answer he gave me was one that I think changed my life, because it was one that he said, "Don't build new prisons, they cost too much. They cost too much." That, to me, as a conservative Republican, first of all, meant money. Lots of bits about cash. They cost a lot of money. So I'm going to ask you a question. One of the things that I do when I do these things is ask for a little bit of audience participation. So I'm going to ask you a question. Now, the answer is going to be pretty easy in most cases. The answer is going to be the same. Okay? But the question that I got to ask was an engineering question, basically, right? I mean, the boss has just said, "Don't build new prisons. They cost too much." How much does a new prison cost in your state? Too much. How about too much? That's a good answer. How about a lot? A lot. Okay. Well, I had to figure that out. Okay. An easy one. It was about, for a prison in medium and maximum security facilities, it cost about $250,000 to build. Okay? They held about 2,500, maybe a little less than the number of prisoners. That's a lot, right? How many prisons do you have in your state? I asked a question. What's the answer? A lot, probably. How many did we have? Well, boss, I figured out we had 112 at that time. 112 prisons. How many people do you have in the prisons in your state? A lot. A lot. How many did I have? Well, about 150,000 at the time. That was the third largest system in the nation. The two largest are the federal system and the state of California. That's all. That's all that were bigger than ours, okay? Well, an engineer was given the thing by the speaker. He says, "Don't build new prisons." All right, I got space. I got enough to hold just over 150,000, okay? I got three choices. One, I can build, I can let them out the back door, or I can somehow or other figure out the way to slow them coming in the front door. That's the only choices an engineer can think of to start with, right? So, and I've already been told, don't do the first. Don't build new prisons. They cost too much. All right, so I've got two choices. How many of you think that in Texas it would have been a truly good choice for us to open the door and let them out? That's right. It would not have been. It would have been too little. It would have been very bad. Doesn't happen very often. That choice, as was presented here, is one that California has, is not one that enhances public safety. And that's what partially it's all about. One of the questions I started asking real early was, well, what's the mission of this thing? What's this corrections department? What are they supposed to do? What's their mission? And I think Texas has a pretty good mission statement because they talk about 4 things. They talk about public safety, they talk about paying the penalty, they talk about victims' restitution, and they talk about rehabilitation, reentry. And as missions, I would suggest every one of you look at your missions that you have for your Department of Corrections and see what they are, and see if it does in fact include something that says talking about reentry, and then ask them how well they're doing on that. And that's the question that has led to many of the answers that you see up here that we're going to be talking about. But, all right, the other thing I could do is slow them coming in the front door. Well, that to me seemed like, as this rookie chairman, seemed to be the only thing I could do, so I started looking for resources that says, how do I slow them down? How do I keep them from coming in the front door? And what happened was I had a probation department that had some pretty good ideas. They talked about, well, where are the people coming from? Well, they're coming in from the counties, obviously, and many of them are coming in off things we call technical violations or technical revocations. Right? How well does your probation system work? And all those things were part of that question, but that's one of the things we started looking at. And I started looking for resources around and found walking the aisles an unemployed statistician named Tony Fabello, who was walking around doing some things in the state of Texas, helping us with, could come in and help me with some of the numbers. So we had people coming in talking about numbers and talking about ideas, and we put together a probation bill. I found an ally over in the Senate, a Democrat, who knew everything about about the prison system. I mean, he was an expert on it. It really is. His name's John Whitmire. Great guy. And we sort of put together a little coalition to look at how do we handle the probation side, because maybe we can slow the population a little bit by changing things in probation. We put together a probation bill. John had one that he sent over from the Senate, and the Senate passes everything 31-0 in the state of Texas, and it was a terrible bill and wasn't going to get through the House. We modified it substantially, passed it through the House, and came within 1 vote of getting it done because the governor didn't vote for it at the end. He vetoed it. But it had some things in it like expansion of the drug courts. We were going to expand the capabilities in the state of Texas on drug courts and make sure they had adequate funding for them. And we were going to change things on the probation side to start looking and really do it smart probation, where we put the probation officers looking at the people that they should have been looking at and not just collecting money from those guys that have been there 6 or 7 years in the system and just kept showing up regularly, and that's all they had to do was come in and have their meetings. We put that in the bill. Didn't work, but I also found out that I had some great groups out there to help us. I mean, somewhere along the line, I found the Council of State Governments, and I found the Pew people, and we found that Texas had a couple of wonderful think tanks, one what I would consider very liberal, and one very conservative, but I also found when I brought them into the room and started listening to them that when they talked about criminal justice, you know what? They talked about almost the same things. I mean, they may have had some extremes on either end, but if I threw them out, almost everything else they were saying, they were close to agreement on. Well, they may have used a little different terms or anything, but they were agreeing. So after that first session that I had, I put them to work as an interim panel and said, okay, you guys go work it out so we can get a probation bill through this next time that will be passed, that will meet the governor's objections that he had, but that we can pass. And to their credit, they went in the rooms and basically spent another year and a half working on the probation side and came up with recommendations that we turned into 3 pieces of legislation. But I also was starting to learn at that time. And as a legislator, you start to learn because you can do these things. You can do these things on a very partisan basis. You can do them on a bipartisan basis. And I figured out that by working with Senator Whitmire, who knew the stuff on the details of it, that we could put together things that were very much bipartisan, that were very much things that were, I'm going to disagree a little bit with the Attorney General's office on smart and tough. I think you put them together. I think you can be both smart and tough at the same time. And I think you do the right thing for public safety by being both smart and tough, and that you can do that. And that's what we tried to do in the items that we had. So we started looking at all of the factors, and I got to admit, I started learning a whole lot more as we went on, started figuring out a whole bunch more things that could be done with the help of people like Mike Thompson and the help of, obviously, my friend Tony Fabello and many, many others. And Mark Levin, I think Mark's here someplace. I saw him just a little while ago from the Texas Public Policy Foundation, that we put together a whole lot of ideas into the areas of probation and parole. And I learned what we could do in the prisons that said we needed more drug treatment. What percentage of your population is in there for nonviolent offenses? Question. What's the answer? A lot. I think that's correct in your states, probably. There's a lot of them that are there for nonviolent offenses. Probably it's about, like we had, about 70% of them were there. And how many of them have mental health problems? A lot. I think that's right. If you could do something in those areas, maybe you could make a difference on that population. And I came into the 2007 legislative session with a projection from our legislative budget board that said by the year 2012, which is not very far off now, that we were going to have to build 17,000 new prison beds in the state of Texas. 17,000. And the governor in his budget had recommended that we spend, as was pointed out earlier, between $500 and $600 million in additional expansion for prisons. And I will tell you, that was the opening we really needed. Because instead of spending $500 to $600 million, we looked at the programmatic things that we could do, the differences and the changes that we could make. How much did they cost? How much did they run? And lo and behold, they did two things. First of all, with the statistics we had, we spent less money than the governor was going to spend in building new prisons. And secondly, they changed that population trend. Because fortunately, Dr. Fabello had done a Texas Public Policy, Texas Criminal Justice group that he had fortunately done before and had the statistics and the data that we had that showed how well programs worked, because it's something you got to have is working programs. And with those working programs, we were able to figure out that we could do those, we could expand those that needed to be done, we could do the right things on others and increase or put in some new programs some places, and found that the prison population we were going to project was not going to go up, but it was going to, at worst, remain steady, and at best have a slight drop. So we took those numbers and we put them into the plan, and I'll tell you what, the legislature, the leadership in the legislature all bought into that. They bought into the ideas that it was a better thing to have. And we passed that without really changing penalties and without changing a lot of other things in the law. We changed it in the Appropriations Act and put all of those programmatic things into place. When we came back in the year 2009 for our last session, the same people who had said we had to build 17,000 new prison beds by the year 2012 now say we don't have to build any more. Not a single one, at least until the year 2014. And not only that, but we were able to retain those programs in a tough budget year, obviously. We were able to retain those and keep them going and keep them moving. And we were able to project, in fact, that our population has dropped, and our prison population from the amount that we went up to, which was about 156,000, now down to right at 154,000. We've actually seen a drop in the prison population. And it's put me on the same scales with Massachusetts as the lowest, as the greatest drop in increases, at least in the number of people going to prisons of any state in the union. And I'm glad to be linked with my friends in Massachusetts, as I have with my friends in Connecticut, and my friends in New York, and doing all the things that we've been able to do in the past. We're now able to do those things and move forward on those. So it's been great, and to think that those little things that we've done by this guy who had never done any of that stuff before in his life, that you could in fact be then standing here in the halls of Congress and telling people like yourselves that in fact it does work, it will work, and we can make a difference is a wonderful experience that I certainly wouldn't trade for anything in my life. Thank you all for the support and the help you've been. Thank you. Roger.
Well, I too appreciate the opportunity to be here. I think all of you got these little handouts for Kansas and Texas, and I believe that my task is to describe what we did to get those kind of results. I was also told that I couldn't use any PowerPoint slides. I guess you have to be elected to use those sorts of things or fund this conference. So I'll do the best I can, but at any rate, let me talk about what it took to get the kind of reductions that we were able to achieve in my state, and then describe for you in some detail what those results were. Oftentimes, I think we try and think of a particular piece of legislation or a law that can be passed, and in some instances that was useful to us, but I think what was as important, or perhaps even more important, was not legislation, but legislators. and other policymakers. And one of the things that was most helpful to us in being able to chart our course was clarity of expectations. It was clear to us that the governor and our legislature wanted us to cap costs. They wanted us to cut recidivism. If you took a look at the Kansas experience at the time, about 65% of our prison admissions were probation and parole violators, not new court commitments. And if you think about the kinds of things that correctional agencies and administrators like myself are criticized for, it usually comes in one of three categories, and AT can bear this out, and Dennis Schrantz from Michigan is referring to A.T. Wall from Rhode Island, I see back there. But the things that we typically get criticized about: escapes, cost, and recidivism. Now let's think about those three things for a minute and talk about what it is that we can do. Because if you look at our mission statements, you heard Representative Madden talk about agency mission statements, you'll find that it's pretty much in common that all of us say something about public safety. And if you look at the Kansas vision statement, it's a safer Kansas through effective correctional services. Well, everybody can pretty much agree that we want a safer Kansas. What we often disagree about is what is effective and what constitutes effective correctional services. In our effort to achieve a safer Kansas, we took a look at a couple of things, and I may speak a little bit of heresy in front of this audience first, but incarceration works, and incarceration is effective, but it is an immediate strategy. And what we decided to do was take a look at performance measures, and one of the simplest performance measures that we came up with around incarceration is to take a look at the opportunity that somebody incarcerated in a Kansas prison had to go out and physically harm somebody in Kansas. And the way that we did that is we simply divided the number of escapes that we had, or the number of walkaways from our unfenced minimum security facilities and work release centers, by the average daily population. And what you get is this: in Kansas, in a bad year, the probability of somebody incarcerated in a Kansas prison getting out and physically harming somebody in the community is 2/1000ths of 1%. And the probability of somebody from a higher custody facility getting out and harming somebody in a Kansas community is 2/10,000ths of 1%. Now, we talked about, Representative Madden and Adam and I have been traveling around the country quite a bit, had a chance to do similar calculations for North Carolina and Florida, and the numbers are the same. And my guess is that if we did this for every correctional system in the country, what you'd see are similar numbers. The point is this: no matter how much harder we try, no matter how much more money we invest, it's going to be harder to improve on that level of performance. Yet that's often what we spend our resources on. It doesn't mean you diminish your ability along that dimension, but if we're going to make Kansas safer, what we ought to take a look at is what happens when these folks are released and come back to Kansas communities. Because in my state, somewhere between 95 and 98% of the people incarcerated in our prisons are going to return to our communities and live amongst you and I. And back in 2003 and 2004, 65% of them were coming back to prison. So what we began to talk about with policymakers and with our staff and with the news media was, if we're going to improve our performance, if we're really going to make Kansas safer, what we need to do is not focus additional efforts and resources on an immediate strategy which says we're going to contain that negative offender behavior, but we're going to focus on reducing the probability that that negative offender behavior will occur once the individual is released, regardless of the environment that they're in, regardless of whether they're confined or not. And we used a strategy we simply labeled risk management. And within risk management, we had two components, containment and reduction. Now, the reason that we chose containment is that when you talk with criminal justice people, a lot of times we talk about control. And I would argue that we can't control anybody. If we could control behavior, there would be no escapes. There would be no assaults in prison. There would be no drugs in prison. If we could control behavior, there would be no recidivism. But the reality is that's an unreasonable expectation. So when we think about the incarceration part of our operation, we're simply talking about containing that behavior, and that changes the set of expectations, and it changes the set of strategies that you use to manage folks within that environment. But then the other piece is, let's talk about risk reduction. Let's talk about reducing the probability that somebody's going to reoffend once they're released from prison. And when you start to focus on that, it leads you to a whole different set of interventions and strategies and solutions, and you look to a whole different set of research literature to guide your activities. The most important thing that our legislators did for us was endorse that strategy. And what we asked them to do was not take a vote. We didn't ask them to pass legislation, but we asked them to put in committee minutes that they wanted us to reduce recidivism. They wanted us to use evidence-based practices. They wanted us to use data-driven decision-making strategies to try and produce a particular set of results that cut returns to prison and cut costs. We also agreed to a set of performance measures, and this was critically important. In addition to reductions in recidivism, we wanted to cut absconding, those folks who were actively evading supervision. We wanted to cut the use of jail days, where we were locking parolees up temporarily as an intermediate intervention, not because we told our parole officers to stop locking people up, but because they didn't need to use that intervention. We wanted more active community partnerships that gave us access to additional services and involved more people in both the incarceration portion of our operation and the post-release supervision portion of our operation. And most importantly, we asked to be evaluated on trends and frequencies rather than on individual events, because we can all point to states within the last 2 or 3 years whose budget has been disrupted, whose prison operations have been disrupted because policy was formulated in response to an individual event. And fortunately, we were able to talk with our legislature about this at a time when we didn't have one of these high-profile events occurring in our state. But the discussion went something like this. With the population that we work with, it is an absolute certainty that some of these individuals will harm citizens in our state, and some of that harm will be very, very serious. We're asking you to judge us on our ability to alter the trend or the probability or the frequency with which those kinds of things occur, rather than on individual events. And our legislature agreed. Most importantly, perhaps, was we also had bipartisan support, and there's been discussion about that today. My governor at the time, Governor Sebelius, who's now Health and Human Services Secretary here, and is at the left in the Kansas political spectrum, and Senator Brownback, who is at the far right in the Kansas political spectrum, both appeared jointly in 2005 before our legislature endorsing these strategies, and all of a sudden the partisan politics went out of that discussion. And that made it so much easier for us to accomplish some of the things that we did. But one of the things that Senator Brownback said in that conference was, I want to see recidivism cut in half in this country in the next 5 years, and I want it to start in Kansas. He said that in 2005. I was sitting about as far away from him as I'm sitting from this table, and my thought was, yeah, right, that's going to happen. But the fact of the matter is that it did in Kansas. And one of the reasons that it did was because of bipartisan support. Another reason that it did was because of a rational approach endorsed by the legislature. And the third reason that it happened was we were blessed with an abundance of resources, both from inside the state and outside the state, particularly the JET Foundation, National Institute of Corrections, Pew Trust, making substantial contributions to our effort, which our legislature faithfully backfilled every time we were able to demonstrate success. And let me talk to you just very briefly about the data that was provided to them and the results that were achieved. We were able to reduce our prison population by about 7%. We were able to close 6 small facilities, 447 beds. Now that pales in comparison to the thousands of beds in the 19 facilities that Michigan closed, but we're a small state, and this was a big deal for us. At the same time, the parole population rose almost 44%. Inmate grievances in our facilities went down 36%. Parole revocation rates on a monthly basis were cut from 203 in 2005 to 96 in fiscal year 2009. That's a monthly return rate. And we lost in this round of budget cuts that we went through, just like everybody else did. We lost 65% of our programming resources, 90% of our state general funding going towards treatment, education, and support services. We swore that our revocation rates would go back up. They didn't. They continue to decline. Fiscal year 2010 to date, that rate has dropped to 94 per month. The absconder rate dropped by about 70%, and most importantly, we began to track felony reconvictions of people on post-release supervision, because the kinds of criticism that you would expect from opponents of this policy, and they would be legitimate if this is what we were doing, is of course you can accomplish all of those things if you ignore the negative offender behavior and simply let it go. We reduced felony reconvictions of parolees while under parole supervision by 36%. That's probably the best measure that I can think of to verify that criminal activity is going down within this population. And we're trying now to gather comparable data at the front end of the system for our locally operated community corrections programs. Finally, we've been tracking, since I came to the department in 1982, return rates to prison in annual cohorts. And looking at the most recent year for which we have data compared to fiscal year 2001, that would be 2008 at a one-year follow-up, we saw a 21.2% net change in improvement in people successfully completing parole, or a 47% rate of improvement. At 2 years, it was a 20.1% net change, but a 52% rate of improvement. At 3 years, 16.6% net change, 46% rate of improvement. 4 years, 11% net change, 33% rate of improvement. 5 years, 4.4% net change, 14% rate of improvement. Now that's a modest return on that 5-year increment, but here's what I'd like you to think about that. We were into this effort 1 year at that time, so the dosage that those individuals received was very modest. So I think there's a lot of reason for hope. When I get in front of groups like this, I almost always ask for something. When it's legislative committees, I sometimes just ask them to leave me alone. But in this instance, I think there are a lot of people who have the ability to influence policy in this room, and particularly influence it at the national level. And there's been a great deal of discussion about data and data-driven decisions. How many of you are old enough to remember VOIDUS?
A lot.
Violent offender incarceration / truth in sentencing. It was federal legislation that spent literally billions of dollars in this country to build prison beds and create incentives to keep people in prison longer. Kansas, like many other states, chased those federal dollars. And one of the things that we did was change our good time rates from 50% to 20% to 15% to comply with the requirements of voidus legislation. And now what we're talking about in this country and in this room is undoing a lot of the effects of voidus. Well, I think that the only way to get to meaningful, data-driven decisions in this country is to provide some sort of comparable incentive that will allow states to modernize their information systems so that we do have meaningful and easily accessible data to use. Systems currently can't talk to each other. It's difficult to extract data. And the incentives that are currently available for some of the modest efforts that are sponsored in particular by National Institute of Corrections are not sufficient to move states in the direction that we need to go. If we're going to be serious about pursuing this and making data-driven decisions, I think one of the things that we need is a federal level effort that guides us to modernizing our systems and allowing us to really access the data so that we can really make meaningful comparisons and make much better informed decisions. Thank you for indulging me on my soapbox.
Good morning. I'm Mike Thompson. I'm keenly aware this is the last speaker who will be saying good morning, and also as the person who's typically in the audience who holds up those cards that say 1 minute, or 2 minutes left. I realize I'm going to get a 20-second reminder in just a couple seconds. So I hope you'll indulge me really quickly while I say a few things and then underscore the importance of the afternoon sessions that we have. But first, just again, to echo the thanks to our terrific partners, Jim Birch and Adam Gelb. You guys have fantastic teams at BJA and Pew, and we're incredibly grateful to you and SEMA and Susan Tucker and all that you've been able to do in supporting this work. And we have a fantastic board, Chairman Jeff Aubrey, who you saw, members here, and Representative Madden and Representative Mike Lawler, as well as terrific people who've been involved in guiding our board, like A.T. Wall and Frank Straub. Thank you so much for spending all this time with us. And we have a great team of staff. A CEO who's here today, and David Atkins, two people who spent a ton of time planning this event, Jessica Nickel and Jamal Nelson. The person who's the project director of all this work, who's never home because he's always in the capitals, Marshall Clement, and the fantastic team that he has. The person in his team who crunches the numbers, Tony Fabello, and the people who communicated all, Martha Plotkin and Regina. We're really grateful to you for all you're doing. Three very quick points. I want to just, the three phases of justice reinvestment. The increasing demand for it and the track record, and then what we need to do, I think, together, because we're all in this together as a field, to meet this demand. In terms of the three phases of justice reinvestment, this is a multi-year process. It's an approach that we're talking about. It's about analyzing data and providing policy options. That's a very extensive and exhaustive process that you have to unpack a lot of different information systems and consult a lot of different people, recognizing that every state is unique. We then need to talk about adopting new policies and putting reinvestment strategies into place. You don't just create 2,000 treatment slots and drop them in. You don't just tell probation officers to drop revocation rates. There's a ton of work that's involved with that. And then you need to actually track performance. And again, that's a multi-year process. It's an approach. It's unique to every state. And we're not the only ones who do it. In fact, some of these things we don't do well, and really there's terrific people out there like the Vera Institute of Justice that looks at some of these particular things, run analysis, Urban Institute in terms of measuring progress, that implementation work that's so challenging that places like Center for Effective Policy, CJI, and NIC do so well. You've heard a lot about the track record for justice reinvestment. We've heard about Kansas and Texas and so many of the other states that are beginning to explore it. There is a long queue of states now, governors, legislators, as well as judiciary. And every time I see Don Murray, I add counties as well that are really, like I say, queuing up, eager to get this kind of help, yet the resources aren't out there to support them. To actually accommodate this growing need, I think we as a field are going to need to do several things. We're going to need to make sure that this level of data-driven analysis maintains the kind of rigor that we're talking about. We're also going to need to demonstrate increasing responsivity to local governments who are facing these same challenges with their jail populations. And then the third, we have to make sure that when we employ this justice reinvestment approach, it's interbranch and it's bipartisan and it's collaborative. That's been the hallmark of this project to date. We need to make sure that we maintain that. Now, as far as the afternoon sessions go, again, the purpose of this whole event is to really develop an action plan for congressional leaders, and we have a fantastic group of experts that are talking, and I know that we haven't had a chance to really engage you. That's going to happen this afternoon. We're going to be in room 216 Hart, and we really want to focus on these things that we've seen as key to making these things work. Focusing on individuals' risk to public safety. We hear so much about instruments and how it's used, but how do you use these to inform supervision? How do you use these to think about the allocation of treatment and different kinds of resources? We're going to talk about basing programs and practice on science and quality. So many programs out there now say they're evidence-based. How do we know if there's actually any truth to that? Then once they say that they're off and running and actually adhering to a model, how do we make sure that they're actually continuing to do what they said they would? Effective community-based supervision. We all know the rhetoric now of SWIFT and certain sanctions. We also know we should be talking about incentives. What does that exactly mean? How do we promote it? And applying place-based strategies. We heard incredibly compelling remarks earlier about particular neighborhoods. What do we actually do in those places to make them safer and help the people coming out of prison and jail? I really hope that you will be there in those afternoon sessions at 1 p.m. in 216 Hart. It's going to be a very important conversation, and we're looking forward to it. So thank you very much.